What if one of the most important books tied to the Bible was never lost, but deliberately removed? A text so powerful that it was kept out of the official canon for centuries. A record that may contain the missing key to understanding ancient history itself. The book of Jasher is repeatedly referenced in early biblical tradition, yet it remains hidden from mainstream scripture, as if its contents were never meant to survive public reading. Inside its pages are accounts that echo one of the most disturbing mysteries in Genesis: the Nephilim, beings described as existing in the world before the flood, and even after it. Genesis 6 states, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that." This single line suggests a history far more complex than what is commonly assumed. The book of Jasher expands on that idea, describing a world filled with corruption, conflict, and beings whose presence shaped the fate of early humanity. These were not symbolic figures, but entities tied to a physical reality that once dominated the ancient world. Genesis 6 warns, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that." And Numbers 13:33 reinforces this disturbing continuity, describing the sons of Anak as descendants of the giants, seen long after the flood had ended. That raises a difficult question. If the flood was meant to erase that world, why do traces of it still appear afterward? From the earliest records of Scripture, a pattern emerges that refuses to disappear. A world before the flood, a survival after it, and fragments of something ancient that continues to echo through human history. The book of Jasher stands at the center of that mystery, pointing toward a hidden layer of events that mainstream history rarely acknowledges. It suggests that the story of Genesis may not be complete as it has been passed down. And if that is true, then everything we think we understand about the ancient world may need to be reconsidered from the very beginning. The deeper we go, the more unsettling the picture becomes. What was once buried in ancient references begins to surface again, revealing a parallel layer of history running alongside the sacred texts. These are not forgotten myths in isolation, but fragments of a larger narrative that has remained in the shadows of biblical tradition for centuries. The book of Jasher stands at the center of this tension. Mentioned in early scriptural records, it is referenced but never fully included within the accepted canon. It exists like a missing piece of a larger puzzle, present in name, absent in full revelation. Yet its origins are often considered older than many widely accepted biblical writings, raising difficult questions about why it was never preserved in the same way. Genesis 6 already hints at a world far more complex than modern interpretation often suggests. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. This statement alone implies continuity, not disappearance. The book of Jasher expands this reality further, describing a world shaped by forces and beings that influence the course of early humanity in ways mainstream accounts rarely explore. Its narrative does not stand outside Scripture, but appears to move alongside it, parallel yet separated. Across generations, most official traditions have passed over this text in silence, leaving behind only scattered references and unanswered questions. Why would a book cited in ancient records remain so rarely examined in full? And what was considered too sensitive or too revealing to preserve openly? As the layers of this forgotten record are examined, the boundary between accepted scripture and hidden tradition begins to blur. What emerges is not a contradiction of Genesis, but a deeper, more expanded version of its world. One that suggests the ancient past was far more layered and far more contested than commonly believed. And with each fragment uncovered, the implication grows stronger. The history we inherited may only be the surface of something far more complex beneath it. The questions begin to intensify the moment we examine its absence from the accepted canon. Why would a text mentioned in early tradition be set aside while others were preserved? And what criteria determined which accounts were elevated into doctrine while others were left in obscurity? These are not simple historical curiosities. They point to deeper decisions about what information was allowed to shape collective understanding. The Book of Jasher introduces a narrative framework that expands far beyond the boundaries of Genesis. It does not merely repeat familiar themes. It develops them into a more detailed account of early humanity and the forces described within that world. At the center of this expanded narrative lies the Nephilim tradition, described in Genesis 6. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. This line suggests continuity across time, implying that the presence of these beings was not confined to a single era. Jasher takes that implication further, presenting a more developed account of their origins and influence. It portrays a world where boundaries between human history and the extraordinary are far less defined than modern readings often assume. This raises a fundamental issue: whether the exclusion of such texts was based purely on theological reasoning, or whether broader concerns shaped what was preserved and what was set aside. As these questions accumulate, the narrative tension increases. The absence of Jasher is no longer a passive gap. It becomes an active point of inquiry, forcing a reconsideration of how ancient knowledge was curated, transmitted, and ultimately defined. And the deeper this investigation goes, the more the accepted boundaries of Genesis begin to feel less like a complete frame, and more like a carefully selected portion of a much larger, unfinished story. As these patterns become harder to dismiss, a critical question emerges that cannot be ignored. If Genesis is only a fragment of a much larger record, then what else has never been fully revealed about the ancient world? Stay with this investigation, because the next layer will push the story even further beyond what most interpretations of history ever consider. Jasher presents a far more detailed account of the sons of God described in Genesis, depicting their descent into the human world as a direct disruption of natural and genetic order. What is briefly stated in Scripture becomes, in this expanded tradition, a prolonged collapse of boundaries between the divine and human realms. The result is portrayed as a pre-flood world shaped by escalating corruption, where human society is overwhelmed by forces far beyond its control. These hybrid beings are described not only as physically dominant, but also as carriers of forbidden knowledge that altered warfare, culture, and the understanding of creation itself. Jasher attributes the growing chaos of that age to this mixture of power and corruption, presenting the flood as a decisive act of restoration rather than simple judgment. It marks the removal of a world system that had become fundamentally unstable, yet Genesis 6. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, introduces a tension that cannot be ignored. The suggestion that the destruction was not completely final. Traces of the giants appear again even after the flood narrative. From this perspective, Jasher raises a deeper implication, that the flood did not erase every remnant of the pre-flood order. Instead, fragments of that earlier age may have persisted in hidden or transformed forms, challenging the assumption of a complete break in human history. Jasher extends its narrative beyond the flood, linking post-flood figures to a continuation of earlier, corrupted lineages. Among them, Nimrod emerges not simply as a powerful ruler, but as a figure associated with the attempt to revive the authority and influence of the pre-flood world. The text suggests that remnants of those earlier bloodlines reappeared within early post-flood civilizations, forming dynasties that carried echoes of the ancient hybrid order. In this framework, figures like Og of Bashan are portrayed with extraordinary traits, including traditions that describe his survival through the flood in an exceptional manner. Such accounts imply that the separation between pre- and post-flood worlds may not be as absolute as commonly assumed. Instead, elements of the old order appear to persist, re-emerging in different forms across later generations. From this perspective, Goliath is not an isolated anomaly, but part of a continuing lineage traced back to these earlier giants. His appearance in biblical history becomes one expression of a much longer and more complex thread. Jasher, therefore, frames post-flood history not as a clean reset, but as a continuation of conflict between ordinary humanity and lingering remnants of an older, larger race. Jasher's narrative extends beyond lineage into the physical world, offering an interpretive framework for ancient monumental architecture. The immense stone structures found across early civilizations are presented as remnants of a world with capabilities far beyond modern assumptions. Within this perspective, such constructions are attributed to beings possessing extraordinary strength and knowledge no longer available to humanity. These accounts challenge conventional explanations by suggesting that early history may have included technologies or abilities that were later lost or obscured. Jasher also reframes how ancient discoveries are interpreted, implying that certain findings dismissed by mainstream scholarship may fit into a broader, coherent pattern when read through its lens. This creates tension with established historical models, which generally separate myth from material evidence. As a result, the text indirectly challenges prevailing academic narratives about the development of civilization, urging a reassessment of how origins are understood. It suggests that the foundations of human culture may not be as linear or ordinary as commonly believed, but instead tied to a more complex and uncertain past. Jasher is now being revisited by a new wave of researchers who approach it with renewed scrutiny rather than dismissal. Although debates about its authenticity remain intense, the text is noted for its internal coherence and its ability to expand the gaps left in Genesis, forming a broader and more detailed narrative of early biblical history. In this expanded view, the boundary between the human and the divine world appears far more fragile than traditionally understood. The giants are portrayed not only as physically dominant beings, but also as entities associated with knowledge systems and influence that shaped early civilization in profound ways. The text intensifies the scale of conflict described in ancient history, presenting it as a struggle involving not only nations but deeper spiritual and existential forces. From this perspective, Jasher is interpreted as preserving a narrative of competing lineages and powers that extend beyond ordinary historical frameworks. It also suggests that fragments of pre-flood knowledge may have survived the catastrophe, preserved through later civilizations in hidden or symbolic forms. This includes the possibility that early complex societies inherited remnants of earlier systems of knowledge that are now difficult to fully reconstruct. Biblical references to Jasher in books such as Joshua and Samuel add weight to its historical relevance, raising questions about why such a text was excluded from the canonical tradition. This tension continues to fuel debate among scholars about its role in understanding ancient scripture. Ultimately, Jasher reframes ancient history as a layered and contested record, where the origins of civilization are tied to unresolved conflicts between opposing forces and lineages. Jasher extends the Tower of Babel narrative with a far more complex interpretation of early post-flood civilization. Nimrod is portrayed not merely as a rebellious ruler, but as a figure associated with advanced inherited knowledge that pushed human ambition beyond its intended limits. In this reading, the division of language is framed as a decisive intervention meant to prevent another global breakdown of order. The text encourages a reinterpretation of ancient structures, suggesting that monuments and megalithic sites may reflect capabilities far beyond conventional assumptions about early human development. Large constructions such as Baalbek and the pyramids are viewed through this lens as evidence of lost knowledge rather than simple architectural achievement. From this perspective, global mythologies are not isolated stories but fragmented memories of a shared ancient reality. Jasher is presented as a unifying framework that attempts to connect these dispersed traditions into a single historical narrative, linking biblical accounts with broader cultural myths. The discussion also raises questions about how historical knowledge has been preserved, transmitted, and potentially restricted over time, emphasizing the role of interpretation in shaping what is accepted as history. Within this framework, biblical patriarchs are described as operating in a far more dangerous environment than commonly understood, where conflicts involved not only political struggles but also encounters with forces described in ancient texts as giants. This reframing intensifies the contrast between ordinary human history and the world depicted in Jasher, where early figures are placed in a landscape shaped by powerful and often hostile entities. Jasher is often read today alongside modern developments in genetics and biotechnology, where the boundaries of human biology are increasingly being tested. Advances in gene editing and species modification raise difficult questions about how far human intervention in natural systems can extend before unintended consequences emerge. Within this interpretive framework, Jasher is used as a conceptual mirror to reflect on the direction of scientific progress. It presents an ancient narrative that appears to caution against the pursuit of absolute control over life itself, especially when applied to the fundamental structure of living beings. This perspective draws a parallel between modern technological ambition and older traditions describing the collapse of earlier civilizations through excessive interference with natural order. The focus is not on direct equivalence, but on recurring themes of overreach and imbalance across time. The text also emphasizes a broader philosophical concern: the desire to transcend human limitations. In this reading, Jasher is treated less as a historical account alone and more as a warning narrative about the consequences of pushing beyond defined boundaries of existence. Ultimately, it frames human progress as a double-edged path, where innovation and risk develop side by side, requiring careful reflection on how knowledge is applied in shaping the future. In the modern era, access to less commonly studied or overlooked texts allows a more direct comparison of ancient sources, challenging long-standing interpretations of early history. This shift opens the door to re-examining how historical narratives were formed and preserved. Within this context, Jasher is often viewed as a complementary tradition that attempts to connect written accounts with unexplained archaeological and cultural evidence. It is used to frame a broader discussion about how fragmented historical records might relate to each other. The central tension lies in how history is defined, whether through established institutional frameworks or through alternative readings of ancient material. This debate continues to shape how people interpret origins, civilization, and early human development. From this perspective, Jasher presents a layered view of the past in which human history is intertwined with extraordinary traditions preserved in symbolic or fragmented form. It challenges purely linear interpretations of early civilization. Overall, it suggests that modern understanding may be incomplete, and that ancient records still hold unresolved questions about the depth and complexity of humanity's past. As this investigation comes to a close, if it has changed the way you view ancient history, share your interpretation in the comments below. And if you want to continue exploring deeper connections between forgotten texts, early civilizations, and hidden layers of history, the next chapter is already waiting, beyond what has been revealed here. Between forgotten texts, early civilizations, and hidden layers of history, the next chapter is already waiting.